This year's presidential address to a joint session of Congress will be different than those that came before, in part due to the coronavirus pandemic. Only 200 lawmakers will be in attendance because of restrictions. Also of note will be Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, two women sitting behind the president. This marks the first time that we will ever see that in a primetime address by the president. So for more on what we can expect, let us bring in Joe Watkins, who is the host of State of Independence on Lighthouse TV and former White House aide to President George H.W. Bush. And joining him is CBS News political contributor Antjuan Seawright. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Joe, I'm going to start with you. What are you anticipating to hear from the president tonight? And how will the speech, do you think, be different from past addresses to Congress?
Well, it'll be different, of course, because you won't have the full Congress there. And no matter what you say, it's just a different atmosphere when you've got everybody sitting there. You know, they always leave one member behind, one person behind, so that the government can continue on, God forbid, in the case of a catastrophic event. But that won't be necessary tonight because there'll only be a couple hundred members of Congress there to witness the speech as he gives it. The president, I think, is going to obviously talk about family aid and his family aid plan, and everybody's anxious to hear it because these are issues that matter to everybody. Child care, of course, family leave. These are all important issues. College and the possibility of community college and free community college, as the president is proposing, and the like. But I think the challenge for many, certainly for Republicans, will be how do we get there? You know, these are all things that we care about. The pandemic, obviously, everybody cares about as well, and infrastructure we all care about. But how do we get there? And what the president's proposing is $1 trillion in new spending and $800 billion in new tax credits. That's a lot to swallow, and it's a heavy lift, I think, for Republicans. And you're also talking about raising those marginal tax rates on Americans who make more than $1 million a year, and also raising the capital gains tax 30 to 39.6%. These all become a heavy lift for Republicans and maybe even for some Democrats. And so the challenge will be for the president not just to give the speech, but to see if he can make good on his promise and get it passed.
Antjuan, President Biden has the opportunity to discuss his accomplishments in his first 100 days. What do you expect the president to focus on? I mean, we've talked a little bit about his infrastructure plan, his successes in battling COVID-19, but how do you think he'll reach across the aisle to help push that American Families Plan to, for example, Republicans who are not all sold on it?
Well, I think just adding some historical background color to tonight, Anne Marie said it in her opening, you will have two arguably of the most transformational women in U.S. political history sitting behind him. But this president will go into tonight with the highest approval rating of any president in modern day history. I think the CBS poll had him somewhere around 58. He went 11 pieces of legislation into law, 41 executive orders, and not to mention two perhaps of the most consequential pieces of legislation in my political day, the American Rescue Plan, I call it the American Survival Act, and his several trillion dollar infrastructure package. All of those things enjoy over 50% support of the American people. That's Democrats and Republicans. So I think the president will definitely flirt with those two pieces, those two ideas that he has introduced, but he will present the American Families Act that will be a direct investment, not an expense, into the American family. And I think it has a tremendous focus. If you look at the meat and potatoes of the proposal, has a tremendous focus on working women, who is a growing large constituency in this country, whether it's family paid leave, whether it's child care, whether it's medical leave. I mean, so many things that you'll hear tonight. Joe talked about the college affordability, including free community college, which has enjoyed overwhelmingly bipartisan support. In fact, there are several Republican-leaning states that already have similar plans introduced. So I think tonight he's going to do a lot of blocking and tackling, blocking out this narrative that you cannot work across the aisle to get things done, but really tackling the issues in his speech that the American people want. And I say the American people because all the things he has talked about thus far enjoy over 50% of the American people's support.
Joe, the president's likely to talk about some hot button issues. You can call them hot button issues. You can call them issues where there hasn't seemed to be a lot of cooperation between the two parties. Immigration is one area where there hasn't been a lot of movement. Gun violence hasn't been a lot of movement. There is some conversation now amongst both parties about police practices and reform there, especially with the recent killings of black men. What do you think the message will be from Joe Biden on some of these more uncomfortable topics?
I hope that it'll be a hopeful and upbeat message, and a message that's inclusive of all Americans. Clearly, we have challenges with policing, and I've talked about that in the past. And I know that a lot of our leadership has talked about how we fix this, how we stop what's happening, so that we don't see continued incidents of people of color being stopped by police and dying, being killed while in their custody. So there needs to be reform. I'll be interested, as everybody, to hear how he wants to go about doing it. There's some great proposals on the table right now. It'd be wonderful if Republicans and Democrats could come together and move forward. I know Tim Scott's been a real champion on the Republican side for getting this police reform legislation done, and hopefully that'll happen. But looking to hear the president talk about what we can do better as Americans, how we can learn to love each other, and how legislatively what that looks like.
Antjuan, let's talk foreign policy. That'll be another big talking point. He'll likely discuss his announcement to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th. But what will we hear from the president when it comes to global threats from China and Russia and the nuclear ambitions of Iran and North Korea?
I think we'll get a real foreign policy bill of health update. This president started out the gate coming into office with experiences that not many presidents in modern history have had. He's been the vice president of the United States before, so foreign policy that's his thing. And so he's been aggressive in places where the former president has not, i.e. dealing with Russia and some of the things we know Russia has done. But it's also been a breath of fresh air, I think, both abroad and at home. You see foreign leaders starting to embrace this idea of America being the leader again and not being embarrassed to work with and work alongside the American leadership. And I think you will hear some of that in the president's address tonight. But in talking to some of his top lieutenants, you're also going to hear him lay out the challenges and give a real reality check about some of the challenges we face abroad and some of the real threats that could mean for us back at home. And the good news, I think, about this president, you will hear honesty. You won't have to worry about the fact checkers sitting at a computer trying to fact check everything, because we do not know what's going to be a lie and what's not. And so I feel good about what the president will bring from a foreign policy standpoint. But as we talked about in the intro, I think foreign policy will be a part. But I think this speech tonight will really focus on restoring the soul of America and what that means. Because when we restore the soul of America, I think the stuff outside of America becomes a bit easier.
Joe, you mentioned Senator Tim Scott and his efforts when it comes to police reform. He's at the center of a bipartisan talks to get this done. He's also going to be delivering the official response from the GOP. So chances are police reform is probably going to come up. But what other issues do you think he's going to zero in on?
Well, obviously, the economy matters, and he'll talk about that. But he'll talk about police reform. He'll talk about how we get there. I think Tim Scott, like a lot of other Republicans, says, all these issues that the president plans to talk about tonight are important issues for all of America. But the question becomes is, how do we get there? And I think what Republicans are worried about is our policies that certainly sound good, but at the end of the day, when you look at the details, they end up being more of the same in terms of tax and spend. And Republicans want to guard against that. They want to guard against policies that are more tax and spend policies, especially when you talk about $1 trillion in new spending and $800 billion in new tax credits. The Republicans want to say, let's get it done. Let's work together. Let's move the country forward. Let's answer and deal with all these important issues, but let's do it in a way that's fiscally appropriate and responsible.
All right, Joe Watkins and Antjuan Seawright, always great to have you both. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.